Welcome to How to Build Your Own PC. This course has been designed to give you all the information and instruction you need to successfully build your own PC. By building it yourself, you will not only have a great new understanding of how computers work, but you will also easily save hundreds of dollars on the cost of your new computer. First, I will introduce you to the parts that make up your computer. Then we will build our own computer, step by step, and you will learn all about the parts, their locations, and how they connect to each other. The way we will build our computer is a general procedure and can easily be adapted to virtually any configuration. Now let's begin. This is the most important part of the computer system, the motherboard. It supplies all of the electrical connections among various components of the computer. It is very important that you don't unwrap any of the parts before you learn about the danger of static electricity, which we will explain in Chapter 3. I will explain more about its connectors in the chapter Installation of the Motherboard. This is the fan and heat sink. We will connect it to the CPU and install both as a complete unit onto the motherboard. And this is the CPU, or processor. It is the actual brain of a computer and is responsible for processing instructions and carrying out users' commands. We will be installing a Pentium 3 CPU. If your CPU doesn't look like this, don't worry. There are many different types available, but the way they work and how they install are very similar. This is the DIMM chip or RAM chip we will install. RAM provides the working space for open applications. The storage capacity of RAM is measured in megabytes. This is a 128 megabytes DIMM for high performance. This is our hard drive. We have chosen an Ultra DMA drive because it is fast and inexpensive. Most new motherboards support this type of drive. This hard drive has a capacity of 9 gigabytes. This is the DVD-ROM drive we will be installing. DVD, or digital video disc drives, play not only DVDs, but also audio compact discs, CDs, and CD-ROMs. A DVD disc is the same size as a CD, but DVDs can store about 25 times more information than conventional CDs. A DVD can store 4.7 gigabytes on a single side, or up to 17 gigabytes on a double-sided. This is the floppy drive. It reads and writes information on removable diskettes that hold about 1.4 megabytes of data. This is the video card or graphics adapter. Almost all video cards today feature 2 megabytes of video memory. This video card also has built-in 3D functionality. Intense 3D rendering requires a lot of data to be processed very quickly. Since the 3D chip works very hard, it has its own cooling system, a fan. Here we have the sound card. It is an expansion card that enables a computer to produce sound. Examples of uses for sound capabilities include games, music applications, and interactive educational software like this. This is the network card we are going to install. We are installing a network card instead of a modem because we want to use the system in a network environment. A keyboard and mouse are two of the most inexpensive components attached to any computer system. We will use the PS2 style connectors for both components. And we are going to use standard speakers with a 1/8 inch mini jack connector. The monitor can be the most expensive single component of a PC system. It is great to have a nice and sharp monitor, but it's the graphics adapter that controls the resolution of the image and number of colors that can be displayed. If you try hooking up your 6- or 7-year-old monitor on your new AGP graphics card, it may not work. Monitors have gotten cheaper, so it is a good idea to get the biggest size you can afford. Now that we have introduced you to the components we are going to use, check the list of your PC parts to ensure you have enough components to assemble a working PC. This is the tool, the only tool we need to build a PC, a Phillips screwdriver. Before we start, make sure you have all the computer parts you need to build a working PC. You do not have to buy the same parts we are going to use, but it is a good idea to stay with our recommendations if you are new to computers. If you do decide to use different parts, the same basic procedure can be used to put any components together. Before you start, you should use our checklist to help you get ready. Go to the CD menu and click on the checklist icon. Is your checklist completed? Okay, then let's begin with our PC building instructions. Before we start, please follow our instructions step by step. This will help you to avoid unnecessary danger to your computer components. Do not open the packaging of your new parts or touch them until you know how to do it properly. The parts we chose are representative of the majority of options you may encounter. This is an ATX mid-tower from the back. I remove the 4 screws that hold the mid-tower cover to the frame of the case. Loosen the screws whose heads are covering some of the painted edge of the cover. Do not remove other screws. They may hold the power supply in place. And now we can remove the cover. Use both hands. It may still be difficult to slide free. Here, from the case back, we can see the openings in the metal shield for the in and out ports. And these are the metal shields for the slots we will remove later to put the cards in. I like to flip the case. It makes it easier to work with. It is relatively easy to avoid problems with static electricity. I touch the case or an electrical ground each time I am going to work with electrical parts, or before I unpack my computer parts. Remember to do the same when you begin putting your own PC together. Now I will give you a quick orientation about different areas and connectors of the case. My case has a speaker already installed. You may have to snap the speaker into place yourself. It is very easy. There are more cables for the motherboard. These are the drive bays. This is for a 3.5-inch drive, and this is for a 5.25-inch drive, including a CD-ROM drive or a large floppy drive you may want to install. This connector goes to the motherboard. This connector goes to the hard drive and the CD-ROM or DVD drive. This small connector plugs into your 3.5-inch floppy drive. This tiny black connector plugs into the motherboard and lights up the power LED on the front of the case. If you follow these wires to their source, you will come to the power supply. Now that you are familiar with the inside of the empty case, we can learn more about the components we will be installing. This is the motherboard or mainboard and is the heart of the computer. We will be installing this inside the case first. Our motherboard is designed for a slot 1 CPU. We are going to be installing a Pentium 3, so this is why we need this configuration. If you are not going to install a Pentium 3, just make sure to ask the salesman which motherboard you need for your particular CPU. Now let's identify the different areas of the motherboard that you need to be familiar with. These are the ISA slots. Certain components like modems or other cards might plug in here. These are the PCI slots. They are the new generation of slots and designed for components that require faster data access. Cards like video adapters or high-speed interface cards often use a PCI slot for faster performance. This is the AGP or Advanced Graphics port. The purpose of the AGP slot is to accelerate all graphics functions. The only card you can plug in here is an AGP-compatible graphics adapter. If your motherboard has an AGP slot like this one, you should definitely buy an AGP graphics adapter. This is the BIOS chip. Software stored on this chip controls the basic functions of your PC and how the components connect and work together at their most basic level. On the newer boards like this one, you can update this software when new versions are released. A new version might support a new type of CPU or other component. These are the connectors for the hard drive, CD-ROM drive, DVD drive, and floppy drives. And these are the ports for the DIMMs, the dual inline memory modules. This is where we will plug in our RAM. Now let's look at the rest of the connections. This is the CPU slot where we will plug in our Pentium 3 CPU. These are the serial ports. If you have an external modem, it might plug in here. This is the parallel port. This is where you will plug in the printer. Here are two USB ports. These are designed for USB devices like digital cameras, scanners, and many new add-on peripherals for your PC. And these are the PS2 connectors. This is where we will plug in our mouse and keyboard. Now I will install the motherboard into the case. I will first line up the board with its ports to the ports frame of the case, like this. The holes of the board have to line up with the holes on the mounting area so that you can put the brass standoffs in. If the holes in the mounting surface are not labeled for the type of motherboard you are going to use, then line up the holes by eye. As you can see here, each of the holes for your motherboard is surrounded by a shiny ring of solder. Here are the various screw points for my board. After I locate my screw point for the board, I will mount the motherboard to the mounting area. This is a brass standoff. Use these brass standoffs only to mount your motherboard to the mounting area. Always double-check the holes you are going to use and count the number of standoffs you will use. Make sure you put the same number of screws in to mount the motherboard on top of the brass standoff. A misplaced standoff can short-circuit your motherboard. These are the points for the screws on my board. And with my fingers, I can screw in the brass standoffs. After I screw them all in, I can mount my motherboard on top of the brass standoffs by screwing in the screws. Once you finish tightening all the screws, your motherboard should be securely mounted inside the case and look like this. Now that our motherboard is installed, we are ready to install our CPU. This is a Pentium 3 processor, and it comes with its active heatsink cooled by a fan. The heatsink comes with 4 legs, for which the Pentium 3 cartridge provides the locking receptacles. I put the actual heatsink into place by pressing the 4 legs through the card. This goes very smoothly and fits perfectly. Other CPUs like the Pentium 2 or the Celeron SEC come with different mounting provisions for their heatsinks, but the installation process is very similar. Make sure that you get the orientation right the first time, because the heatsink is very difficult to remove once installed. After you place the 4 legs through the card, use some force to compress the backing plate springs enough to lock on. This backing plate locks the heatsink to the processor nice and tight. I will install the Pentium 3 chip to the motherboard. These 2 brackets will hold the chip in place. And again, I have to tell you, if you don't have a Pentium 3, the way you have to put your particular chip into place depends on how the processor was designed by its manufacturer. But the installation process is very similar. So here you see the contacts. They have to go into the socket, and this little notch has to fit into the socket. Make sure that the chip with its notch of the contact edge fits into the socket in the right way. When the contact line of the chip matches the way the socket is prepared for it, push the chip in. Now it is installed perfectly. Make sure you install your processor like this. This is the connector from the heatsink fan. The ATX motherboard offers 3 different power points. This connector has to plug in with this red 3-pin head that is located between the DIMM banks and the slot 1 connector. It is usually labeled on the board, right here. This is a memory chip. You can see it has 2 notches in the contact edge. there is only one way to fit the DIMMs into the banks. You have to match the notches to the two blocking pins of the sockets before you can put them in. Also, the banks have numbers you have to follow to fill up. Start with the socket number 1 for the first memory chip. It is important to check your motherboard manual for information on which banks have to be filled up first and in what combination. When you have chosen the right socket for your DIMM, lower the white thumb tabs on either side of the DIMM socket and then insert the chip into the socket. All right, make sure it fits nice and tight. This is the video card or video adapter. It is one of the newest AGP adapters. If your motherboard does not have an AGP slot, you will be installing a PCI video adapter card. Either way, they install the same way. For our AGP card, the connector edge shows a notch that has to match the AGP slot when it is inserted, which ensures you have the correct orientation. This is the connector for the monitor. The connector has to face the back of the case. Notice that the AGP slot is very close to the CPU. This is for speed. The closer the AGP slot is to the CPU, the faster the transfer rate will be. The video card has to exit the case, here. You have to pop out the cover of the video slot port. I can push this piece of metal from the outside and pop it off. It comes off very easily. Now I take the video card and face its connector to the port of the video slot. I match the connector edge to the AGP slot of the motherboard and insert the card. Make sure that it fits securely. I screw in the adapter as soon as it is inserted. When you put the screws in, hold the card down so that it cannot pop out of the bus slot. This is the sound card. Take a look at the connector edge. The length of it indicates that it is an ISA connector and has to be inserted into an ISA slot in the motherboard. You can identify the sound card by its various connectors and the jacks for the speakers and for other in-out audio devices. This is the ISA slot we will insert it into, but first we have to pop the piece of metal out. Then insert the sound card like this. And like we installed the AGP adapter, make sure it fits tight and solid. This is the network card. Pay attention. The connector edge is shorter than the connector edge of the sound card because it is made for the PCI bus connection. Here you can see the jack for the network cable. I will install a network card instead of a modem because this PC will be built for use in a network environment. Installing a modem is similar to this installation. So this PCI connector from the network card has to go in one of the motherboard PCI buses. I will choose the bus that gives me some space in between the other installed cards. First, I remove the slot piece of metal next to the PCI slot for the network card. Make sure to match the notch position of the card with the PCI slot. Tightening the screw sometimes causes the card to move in the slot. If the card is not sitting in the slot properly, the system can fail or behave erratically, so make sure to check your work. Before we secure the motherboard to the computer case, I will give you a short run-through of the components we installed so far. This is the CPU. This is the AGP video card. This is our network card that we have installed instead of a modem. And here we have our sound card. This is the DIMM chip or RAM card we inserted in the first DIMM bank of 4 banks of the motherboard. You always want to insert the first DIMM chip you are going to install in the number 1 labeled DIMM bank and then continue with the next higher number of the bank. Now I flip the case to see how our installed components look from the back of the case. So here we have the connector for the monitor. Here is the jack for the network cable. If you have installed a modem, this would be the jack for the telephone line. And here is the sound card. This is the game port, and here are the jacks for the speakers, line, and microphone. As we move to the top of the case, we can see the rest of our connectors. There is a standard metal bezel that fits around the particular arrangement of the ports that comes with the motherboard. I align the metal bezel to the metal frame over the I/O ports of the motherboard and secure it with its screws. This will hold it in place. Here we have the hard drive I introduced you to at the beginning of this PC course. On the back of the hard drive you can see the connectors. Let's get familiar with what they are. This sticker shows jumper settings. It is a diagram that allows you to configure your hard drive and set your drive's ID. Depending on how many drives you have in your system, you may need to refer to this diagram to set your jumpers. These are the jumpers. These can be plugged in different arrangements according to the diagram we just talked about. It is hard to see such tiny detail in the video, but when you have your drive in front of you, this will all make much more sense. For our project, you need to set your hard drive to master. If you are installing just a single hard drive with no second hard drive, CD-ROM or DVD-ROM drive, you should leave the drive ID jumper on the single setting. This is usually the way it comes set from the factory. The hard drive goes in one of these drive bays. Now I'll position the drive with the connector facing toward me so that the bottom side is facing down when we stand the case back up. The hard drive is usually secured with 4 screws and sometimes with 2, depending on the case. There are some computer cases that provide cages or mounting rails to install the various devices. Consult your case manual for more detail if mounting rails are required. With our case, the drive slides right in. Now let's line up the holes and finish mounting the drive. This is the floppy drive. This is the front where you insert your floppy disks, and this is the back side. This is the bay for the floppy drive, but the installation will be done from the front side of the computer case. I'll slide the drive in from this side so you can see where the bay for the floppy drive is. You will not install it this way. Now, after we determine the right bay for the floppy drive, we can pop out the front faceplate. This is the front of the computer case, and this is the plastic panel for the floppy drive. I'll pop it out by pushing the plastic panel from the back. Now I can slide the floppy drive into the bay from the front of the computer case. Now turn the case to the side again, like we had it before. Here are the screw positions for the floppy drive to secure the drive to the bay. Now we can screw in the floppy drive. Next we have the DVD-ROM drive. This is its faceplate. The connectors are on the back. Your CD-ROM or DVD-ROM drive has jumper settings just like your hard drive. For our project, we need to set these jumpers to the slave setting since our hard drive is set to be the master. Make sure you set your jumpers now before you continue. I will install it in one of these bays. It is similar to the way we installed the floppy drive. First, we have to pop out the cover panel from the bay where the new drive is going. Then we can slide it partway from the front of the computer case into the bay. Make sure you install it right side up so that you can insert a disk. The drive must be mounted later as far forward in the bay as possible. Otherwise, the faceplate of the drive won't line up with the front facade of the computer. Sometimes it can be difficult to fit it in. I usually flip the case onto its side so I can match the holes of the drive with the holes of the bay and secure the drive. Let's turn the case over so we can look at the other side. Now it is easier to match the places for the screws. This drive requires 8 screws, 4 screws on each side of the unit. When you have your drive in the right place, secure it with screws. There are some computer cases that provide cages or mounting rails to install the various devices. Consult your case manual for more details if mounting rails are required. This is the opposite side of the case where I'm securing the DVD-ROM drive with 4 screws. After the screws are in place, we have to connect all the devices we installed so far. We will start with the DVD-ROM drive. Now let's connect all the components to each other and to the motherboard. This is the DVD-ROM drive. Here is the connection for the audio cable. Here are the jumpers for configuring the drive. Make sure you have set these to the slave setting as we described in Chapter 9. Next is the IDE interface connector. And this is the connector for the power cable. Here we have the audio cable that will connect here and then attach to the sound card. This is the ribbon cable that will plug into the IDE interface connector. The connector has a notch, so it will only fit in one way. This is the power cable. It plugs in here. It can only fit in one way, so make sure you have it in the proper orientation when you try to plug it in. Here you see I have connected the IDE ribbon cable to the DVD-ROM drive. As you can see, there is another connector near the middle of the IDE ribbon cable. I can connect this to the hard drive. I will plug it in now so you get the idea. We will actually be connecting it later when I do the other hard drive connections. Now I am ready to connect the power cable to the DVD-ROM drive. The next drive I will connect is the floppy drive. This small white connector is the power connection for the floppy drive. It will connect right here. This is the floppy I/O cable. It will connect to the floppy drive here. After you have connected the power cable and I/O cable to the floppy drive, we can move on to the hard drive. This is the IDE interface connector of the hard drive. You will notice it is exactly the same as the connector on the DVD-ROM drive. Here we have the jumpers for the drive. Make sure you have set these to the master setting as we described in Chapter 8. After you have connected the ribbon cable and the power cable to your hard drive, we can look at our work. Here we have the connections of the DVD-ROM drive, the audio cable, the IDE ribbon cable, and the power cable. The floppy drive I/O cable, the floppy drive power cable, the hard drive IDE ribbon cable, and finally the hard drive power cable. Now we can begin connecting the drives to the motherboard. First, we can connect the cable coming from the floppy drive to the floppy drive interface connector. This connector will be labeled on your motherboard. Next, we will connect the IDE ribbon cable that is attached to the hard drive and DVD-ROM drive. This needs to plug in to the primary IDE interface connector. This will also be labeled on your motherboard. Make sure the connection is nice and snug. Here you can see all of our drive connections are complete. You might want to review this section if anything is unclear. Also, if you are having problems identifying any of the connectors, you should consult your motherboard manual for a diagram of your specific board. Now we can connect the power connector to the motherboard. This wire harness is attached to the case's power supply and has a plastic plug that will fit into your motherboard. The plug will only fit in one way, so make sure you have the correct orientation. Now we are almost done. In the next chapter, we will review our work and put the final touches on our PC. Let's review our project so far. We have here the DVD-ROM drive, our floppy drive, our hard drive, our DIMM or RAM chip. Here are the cards, the AGP or video card, the network card or modem card, and the sound card. This might be difficult to see, but by pointing out the components we installed, you should get a general orientation of how they fit inside the computer. Before we complete the assembly of our system, we have to install the temperature sensor. But first, it is important we talk about configuring your motherboard. Our motherboard we have chosen for this project is jumperless. That means we do not have to set any jumpers on the board to configure it. We will configure our motherboard through the BIOS, or built-in software, when we start the computer for the first time. It is very important that you set your jumper settings if your motherboard is not jumperless. If you do not have a jumperless motherboard, now is the time you should consult your manual and follow the directions for configuring it. You will want to configure your board so it is set properly for the CPU you have before you turn it on, or you may cause damage to the processor. Now let's finish up by installing the temperature sensor. This is where I'll insert the connector for the temperature sensor cable. If your type of motherboard provides this external measurement, consult its manual to find the right installation advice, but it will be very similar to the installation steps I'll show you now. After I plug the connector to the motherboard, I have to attach the temperature sensor, you see here at the end of the cable, to the metal heatsink of the CPU. The metal heatsink structure conducts heat away from the CPU and distributes it into a large finned area where the fan provides active cooling. I'll attach the temperature sensor to the heatsink very close to the CPU. The sensor measures the temperature and tells the system when the CPU gets too hot so that the system can control the cooling. Installing this is very simple. I'll tape it right next to the CPU on the metal heatsink to get a good temperature reading. Now firmly slide the cover back to close the case. Once you have the cover on the case, replace the 4 screws removed in Chapter 3. Let's go to the back of the case to connect the other components. We know these core connectors of the motherboard from Chapter 7, securing the motherboard. First I connect the mouse, the green PS2 connector, to the right port, and the keyboard to the left port. If you mix them up, it will cause a keyboard failure error when you turn on the computer. If that happens, simply switch the connectors. These are the USB ports for USB devices. Here are the serial ports used with an external modem. Next to them is the parallel port that can be used for printers, zip drives, and other parallel devices. Into the video card port, I plug in the monitor connector. It is a 15-pin D-shell 3-row connector that will go in one way and should not be forced. Then I'll insert the network cable connector into the network port jack. Into the sound card, I'll plug the speaker jack connector in the speaker port. The connection is a normal mini stereo plug. The line jack is for connecting music sources such as tape players, stereos, and musical instruments. The mic jack allows you to record your voice into the PC. The 15-pin connector connects to a joystick. Finally, we can plug in the power cord to the power supply and plug the free end into a wall socket. The little switch next to it should be set to 115 volts in the United States. And that is how the back of your computer case should look if you used the same type of components I did. After you plug your system into a wall socket, you can start to install the software. For more information, consult our text file window, Installation of the Software. If you have any difficulties and you need to troubleshoot, just go over the installation process step by step and you should be able to figure out the problem. Congratulations! You built your own PC.